Hi, welcome to our studio, to the future of money. This is our interview and panels discussions on all things related to the industry, financial industry in general, and crypto industry where we live in as well. It is my pleasure to welcome Joy Hiller to the studio with us from Helium. The subject of our conversation today is the DePIN infrastructure, or the decentralized physical infrastructure networks. And we are very lucky to have one of the OGs of the space, and someone who, from little bit that I read and know about you, started with enthusiast and curious builder and trier of things, and then ended up in few years into it as a lead scientific director of Helium and the evangelist for the Helium Foundation and the space in general. So thank you. Zebec network is in the process of venturing into the DePIN space as well, having started as a Solana protocol, as a continuous payment protocol, and have built a series of products in the payments and the real world value flows, from Web3 payroll to Web2 payroll with Web3 features in collaboration with Circle and Stellar, that allows us to empower employees receive partially the payment in USDC if they choose, and work through our partners to cross-border sending money abroad. So there's a lot of payment work we've done, but a very logical space for us also is the point of sale, because on the payroll, we've got companies that we service on the payroll side. So our point of sale terminal project is in early stages right now, but we are lucky that our pilots are already a customer acquisition for us. Is an interesting track because folks already are using our services, and we have multiple pre-orders for the devices. The DePIN world is complex. You've got old-time devices, even the younger production devices, needing to talk to a lot of newer networks, and a lot of newer being adopted to newer software, and throw in the blockchain and incentives for users, merchants, customers. So we're talking gigantic, difficult space, and we're grateful to talk to people who have already been in it for a while. I think you guys are considered to be folks who defined the space and even might have been influencing the name of the space. So please introduce yourself, your tenure and your role, as well as the Helium with all its multiple facets.
Thanks, Elena. That was a fantastic intro. You nailed a lot of those points. So yeah, I'm Joey Hiller. I'm the Senior Technical Director at the Helium Foundation. And as you mentioned, I came into this largely as a community member. Previous to this, I was working at a startup that worked in sort of the advertising space, but my nights and weekends were 100% Helium. And most people in the community thought I worked for Helium, given the amount of time that I spent on it. And, my involvement in the community progressively increased more and more, moving from making little edits to documentation, just being a general part of the conversation as the network evolved, into building a platform for the IoT network in order for folks to walk around with these mapping devices, so we could have this real world survey of the coverage that was being created on the rural network. And so built all of that. And then I had so much fun doing it that I left my last job. And then I think just a few months later, I had the fortune to join the Helium Foundation. I think that was about 3 years ago now. And so yeah, ever since, I've been involved with aspects of governance, the foundation team building product, so the Helium Wallet app, the Explorer. There's various things that we make on a sort of community-facing side, but then there's also a lot that we interface with on the user side. The network exists for the users, so frankly, a lot of our focus goes into those folks. And so everything from making sure that the Helium IoT network has all of the standard roaming interfaces, so that existing LoRaWAN operators, this network that we've built, can go and leverage it, down to the sort of individual folks like you and me who maybe want to connect a couple of devices to make sure that they have a clear experience and that there's enough documentation and guidance so that they can get in there and try things out. So that's a bit of a high level of maybe a day-to-day. There's probably a lot of details that I'm missing in there, but suffice to say, we keep pretty busy.
from what you started to say, and Helium is multiple entities and multiple types, plus the ecosystem of your users and your clients and customers and participants in various products and services. Do you mind giving us kind of a high level of like there's Helium Mobile, there's Foundation, just to understand the brand consistency that everything is Helium?
Yeah, no, I'll help sort of separate all of the names from the entities and the various things that Helium is involved in. So, initially, Helium existed as its own L1, and it had one subnetwork. And so there's this really clean line from blockchain to incentive and the network that it was backing, and that was the Helium network token. But I can't quite remember how far long ago it was. I'm going to say 2 years ago, the community voted to become effectively a network of networks. And so this opened the opportunity for us to bring in yet another subnetwork underneath the Helium network token. And so we effectively split out a space for the IoT network, which is our LoRaWAN network and has the IoT token. And then we also have now the mobile network, the ability for us to build this carrier offering so people can deploy different class of hardware that has a effectively very different job while still being a wireless protocol. And then the Helium Foundation is the entity that's responsible for all of that protocol development, all of the advocacy and things in that regard. The company formerly known as Helium Inc. became Nova Labs and handed all of the IP, all of the identity, all of the branding over to the Helium Foundations as the stewards of the network. And so now Nova Labs is actually a completely separate entity from the Helium Foundation. They have licensed the name Helium Mobile to build the consumer offering on top of this carrier network. And so they are the first service provider that has stood up services on top of the mobile network, but we don't expect that to be the last one. It is very much in our interest as the foundation that multiple parties find value in this service that we're all building together.
What the web of various entities and players sounds complex, but this is still all under the same umbrella and interoperative and talking for the most part, as they need to, and utilizing your services. That's not unlike where we found ourselves as a streaming payroll, pay by the second payroll, continuous protocol settlement that allowed the Web3 companies to use our service and app to pay their employees. Then it grew to yet another product offering and then added the chain. We also, like you, had cultivated a chain of our own as well. And then, but we also expanded to other chains. And I know our home has been Solana always, but also BNB and Near. And you guys chose to move to Solana at some point after experiencing and building your own chain. The reason that's fascinating to talk to you is like, we'd like to know things and pivots that worked and what didn't work and what your advice would be as things progress. But look, let's start from the beginning. Define this space. For people, we talk about IoT, we talk about DePIN, we talk RWA, value flows, and blockchain. Let's start from the beginning. Let's define what DePIN is and what the simple way to understand it would be for someone who isn't in the industry and isn't listening to all the conversations you and I might be privy to.
Yeah, this is a hot topic one. And I probably have some personal takes that separate myself from even my colleagues in terms of what the moniker of DePIN stands for. DePIN is a term that I believe it was Sami Kassab at
Masari, no?
Masari. Yes, thank you. The jet lag is still getting me. So Sami at Masari, I think this sort of this back and forth around like, what do we call this emerging space? We've seen Helium, and now we're starting to see Hive mappers out there, and some of these other players were starting to enter the scene at the time. Demos, I believe, another one that was sort of part of that conversation. It became really clear that this segment of Web3 really stood apart from what we formerly knew in DeFi and NFTs and all of the other sort of things that we've come to know in the broader Web3 space. And I think it's important to think about why Helium and why some of these other physical networks felt like they were this different entity. And to me, that largely had to do with the trust and responsibility that was placed on the individual participants of the network. and specifically, finding ways to make a protocol that coordinated and incentivized and drove forward the build out of something that was valuable in the broader world, right? Outside of Web3. And so that's what we start to see with some of these DePIN protocols. Look at HiveMapper, right? They build these dash cams. They are incredible pieces of technology. They've crammed so much stuff into these things to have hyper precise GPS and high quality cameras. And the only way that that network works is to build a token model, an incentive model that coordinates and incentivizes all of those people to go drive all over the place to collect Street View data, effectively creating this crowdsourced Google Street View, right? And that is something that wouldn't exist without this sort of DePIN concept. It's building the physical infrastructure where the location is a sort of critical piece of this. Like, you need people out in the world, like with the physical hardware, and their collection of all of that data is this thing that creates value. And so we see, sort of a similar analogy also with Dino, right? The thing that they are collecting is telematics on a car, and that connection to the vehicle, this physical thing, is critical. And you've also mentioned RWA, real world assets. Again, we're sort of in that idea where the connection from blockchain to physical thing is the critical piece there. And so the reason I'm pushing so hard on this physicality of it is I occasionally hear these wild claims that, well, Bitcoin is a DePIN because it's decentralized physical infrastructure. But to me, putting servers around the globe and having them crunch on some numbers, like, those entities could be anywhere. Sure, like, you have IPs and things like that, but it doesn't quite drive this local physicality that is a critical piece of the broader DePIN space. That's my take.
I think where you're going with that is like it's a serving the humans in the real world, right? It's not an assumed value. It's really something which is tangible in the real world. And I've spent some time in real estate on blockchain before this gig, and assigning a record or a hash for the real property in the real world, and then connecting it with the records on the blockchain, but then transmitting or interacting with it and transacting with it, or making it more liquid and borrowing against it completely changes the model of the real estate traditional transaction and multiple players, multiple intermediately huge centralized entity controlling this. And think about why Sam and his company started doing what they're doing, which is payroll is very real. Why do we need to wait for 2 months for somebody else having access to our money if we earn it by the hour and sometimes by the second? If with stable coins, we have an opportunity to stream funds across the blockchain and record it immediately and get folks who depend on getting hourly pay, whether or not it's gig economy or is it really someone who needs access to money, borrow against it. So that's kind of a fundamental. So why? That there is a problem, there's a real world need and now a demand. So we talked about some supply, we talked about some demand pieces that are important for DePIN. Now, can we spend a little time on incentives? Because you mentioned that in order to create a supply, you got to incentive folks to use, and that came through technology of blockchain. So that, I think, some of these pieces came together to enable completely unknown business models, not just simply technological models and fun things that connect and live by themselves, but rather serve us. But you also need to be able to incentivize people to create that supply then have others demand it.
Yeah, it's to me, it's incentivizing and coordinating are like two sides of that same coin. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a critical piece of how Helium evolved to be the network that it is today. So if we look back in time, if we think of just about telco generally, if you imagine, like, I'm going to go build a global connectivity network, the first thing that would have popped into your head 10 years ago, 5 years ago, is I'm going to have to go buy leases on towers. These are going to be massive radios. It's going to be tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars per site. And so over time, we've seen some of these barriers go away, largely thanks to evolutions in technology. Like you can set up a LoRaWAN gateway. You could have done this, right? Like that's for quite 10 years ago, but other people were doing LoRaWAN networks before Helium, but they only grew to a particular scale and they only grew in a particular way. And the thing that really unlocked the scale that we see with the Helium IoT network and growing with the mobile network is that through the incentive mechanisms, we're not only able to get people to invest in this hardware and deploy it and try to build solutions on top of it, which is something that, other public networks have tried to do in the past. But the token incentive part of it is also a means to help coordinate. And so you can build rules into the way that all of these tokens are emitted to say, we don't need density of 500 gateways in downtown San Francisco. Like that just simply doesn't provide any additional value for a network. And we don't want to over reward all of the people that are just, standing up a bunch of gateways in that way. And so you can design these token models to push that surplus of hardware into more rural areas. So you can actually build a protocol that says, hey, we want to get out into the rural areas, we want to get out into the small towns. And that's what we've seen with Helium. And it's unfortunately hasn't always been clear to the people deploying these gateways. We often hear people get frustrated, like my gateway's not earning enough, I'm going to turn it off, I'm going to sell it on eBay. But that's actually part of the sort of organic growth of the network is those folks that were downtown with 500 gateways have this, what we call a transmit scale. And so it is effect on the rewards for that gateway. And so they wouldn't earn as much. And so they would turn them off and they would go put them on eBay. But then those eBay gateways end up in the rural towns. And then we see effectively balance. And this is not a done deal. The IoT working group, the community, they're always evolving the protocol and saying like, okay, we have this mechanism of awards going, we need to show some of these values. The community wrote a proposal and passed probably a few months back. And we're always sort of looking at how can we make sure that, again, it's this utility goal. How can we make sure we're best serving that audience? And we will probably continue to tweak that well into the future. But the really exciting things, I talk about this idea of flattening, and it's actually a mechanism that we have seen. So a lot of that overdensity in urban areas has turned off. The folks that are still running their gateways are seeing a greater incentive to continue to do so. Our network has actually, despite a decrease in total number of active gateways on the network, Helium today covers more of the global population than it ever has. And it's largely due to that coordination part of the protocol that has pushed those gateways out to reach more people.
I see. So what you're saying is that the token incentives worked not only to incentivize, but also to manage and control the supply of the supply, so to say, right? So
Yep.
You had, it sounds like you had a problem that everybody loves to have, which is an abundance of clients and participants, right? So it's you're acquiring clients, but it evened out by structuring the blockchain housed token distribution.
It's the blessing and the curse of the Web3 and crypto industry is that nothing happens in moderation. You will grow by massive scales and you will fall by massive scales, and everything is dramatic.
Look, I know I'm taking a little time. We're going to be wrapping up soon, and I want to be respectful of your time limits. But things that you guys pivoted a lot. It wasn't the straight shot. We know exactly where we're going. You're still experimenting. And I think we'll do that too. And when we talk to Sam, he'll share some of this pivots, but lessons, things that were not so well planned out or that were tried out and kind of put to rest. Even moving the chains as well, but having to work in a world where lots of things need to come together in a perfect world, and sometimes they don't. Anything that you can bring up from experience that will be important for us and what's important for the viewers and our listeners?
Yeah. So on this topic, we had our Helium community call yesterday. and Abai, the Helium Foundation CEO, he had some really nice words around the general methodology and then strategy that we as a community take towards the protocol, which is that we are only building forward. We only move forward. This came out of a conversation of the way we write our improvement proposals at HIPS, Helium Improvement Proposal. There was a section in there that was success metrics. And it raised this question of what are we doing with success metrics? It's not like if that success metric fails that we're going to go roll back to some state that we were at 6 months ago. It means that we're going to look at that change and we're going to say, is there something that we can do that would improve this going forward? And so rollbacks aren't a thing that we do largely in our protocol, whether it's a sort of protocol decision or like a technology thing. It's always with the effort of like, let's just be always improving into the next step. And so that some of the classic ones is like our network used to be completely operated on the backs of Raspberry Pis on consumer internet. And that was a really neat idea for 100 to a couple thousand gateways. But there were a lot of challenges with that. Folks that were original to the community will remember having to open ports so that the peer-to-peer part could work. And then we would just murder SD cards because there was so much read-write happening on these devices. And so it became quickly apparent that this is not a solution that is going to scale. And Helium from there moved into a model of operating validators. That was a means for us to operate for a period of time. And then we recognized that that's not going to scale. And then that's where we had to start moving and saying, how can we operate as a protocol without having to maintain our own blockchain? Because for whatever reason, the blockchain would always die on a Friday night, and then engineers would be on it throughout the weekend trying to bring things back to life. And, those are some of the big lessons that we can point back to, but there's also smaller things like we're always improving our proof of coverage mechanisms. There's always work to be done to make processes easier for enterprise to access our network. And we have a lot of conversations with folks around making that as clean as possible, recognizing that a lot of these folks aren't going to want to touch crypto. And so abstracting as many parts of those away as we can. We'll use the transition for them. But fortunately, we've built something that is in such high demand that folks are willing to come to the table and help us. So it's an exciting point to be in our ecosystem. We've gone through a lot of lessons, and I think we've become very accustomed to hearing that feedback and taking action, whether it's from the community or from, well, everyone's our community, but the community of deployers, the gateway operators, or the users of the network.
This is very well said. And I also think that you picked up on something which is important also in our world is on the payroll side or ability to send money abroad. Our clients don't necessarily need to know. It's just easy and it works. And I think you also like to talk about that this is basically back to solving a need and doing it elegantly without anyone needing to understand how complex the world is on the back end or behind closed doors. You've seen some interesting use cases, but is there something that is on top of mind right now that you're seeing that might become interesting? Where it's going? What's the trend? What's the most interesting thing that can come to mind?
This is my favorite question. I get very excited to see evolution in the device space. And so just this past week, I had the pleasure of being in Germany for LoRaWAN Live, which is an annual industry event for the LoRaWAN ecosystem. And I got to talk with large operators and small device manufacturers. And some of the cool things that are out there is we've seen this capability of LoRaWAN being applied into a device so cheap and so small and so low power that you can put it in the format of a sticker, put it on the side of a box, and now you have temperature tracking for this box for its entire life cycle. There's been really big interest in these devices, and we're starting to see evolutions of the hardware as well. And so this company called Mira Micro has sort of taken this concept and they're evolving it beyond, previously it was just multilateration, like take sort of a guess based on the radio attributes to figure out where it is. And then we see rack build evolutions of that, rack wireless, to take that idea and add additional features to it. Now there's an accelerometer. You can figure out when the thing is moving. And so with the evolution that we've seen from Mira Micro, they've actually found a way to include GPS on this tiny little device And they've done it in such a way where they can still maintain this incredibly low power. Generally, if you're in device hardware, putting GPS on something is hard because it takes a lot of energy to do all of the processing. But they found a really clever way to snapshot all of that, upload all of that data remotely, do the solving, and then the actual end device doesn't have to do all of that thinking. And so now you have this sticker that you can put on a box and you know exactly where it is and what it's doing. Really cool to see evolutions on that. I also get very excited about starting to see LoRaWAN and our IoT network used in a consumer space. And so typically this is a protocol that we've largely seen applied to industry. Imagine it's an airline trying to keep track of the food carts or something like that. They're going to hire contractors. They're going to do this big deployment. You'll never know about it as the person on the plane. There might just be some little white box that's stuck in the bottom of the food cart. But what we're starting to see is companies like Demo, which is another Web3 project, and it's really cool example of this cross-chain composability with these protocols, is they've gone and deployed a device that you can buy for, I think it's $99, and it includes 3 years of connectivity built into it that's all backed by the Helium IoT network. And then there's these really cool synergies where the data that's collected from those devices can then be used to analyze and verify coverage on the IoT network again. And so we've been working closely with that team to build some new features coming into like the Helium Explorer. And so that's an area where somebody like you or me can have a LoRaWAN device, and we don't have to think about all of the sort of complicated back-end stuff. You just pick it up, plug it in, and it's working. A bunch of cool stuff happening on the IoT space.
This can be an endless conversation. And again, Thank you so much. It's a great privilege to talk to you and have you as a guest. And I hope to be continued.